I want to go back to the very start and talk about the origins of crowd safety. Where did it come from? Why do we call it what it is? And for those of you who read the articles or the blogs that I write, I've already touched on this, and I'll share it in the description. But I kind of wanted to chat about it today a bit more. So, because I find it fascinating that our perception of crowds has changed and is changing. So it used to be, we used to see it from one perspective, and now we see it from another perspective. So I always find it very interesting how we believe, or we think we believe something, when actually that belief can change. And, there are many studies on our beliefs and how our beliefs can change. And so it's just very interesting that, we do not see things how they are. We see things how we are. That is a quote from someone. I'll try and remember who it was from. Is it Shakespeare? It might have been Shakespeare. And that our perceptions of what's happening, if we're looking at a crowd, and if we think it's going to be, if it's everything's going fine and it's a lovely happy crowd and we feel jubilant, or we start to feel nervous and afraid because we think something's going to happen. And there is actually someone that I know, so Katie Sonnen, who I interviewed in the first episode of Safety Sisters, is studying this area in her PhD. So I'm looking forward to lots of really good stuff coming from what she's studying, because she's looking at people's perception of safety. And that includes, as in when you're in the crowd, how safe you actually feel. So the study of crowds emerged in the 19th century, sort of spearheaded, or not spearheaded, but made famous by Gustave Le Bon. And Gustave Le Bon, and we've got a few more, Gabriele Tardet and Scorpio Sigelli. So, French and Italian, that's where it sort of emerged from. And the purpose was to understand the French Revolution, the revolutionizing crowds, to actually learn how to control them. So it was more about trying to understand why people gathered into crowds in order to actually kind of circumvent this happening and actually, be able to control these crowds, because they were out of control and off with their heads. So it started in a very negative light, in the sense that crowds are bad, crowds are dangerous, crowds are mindless. And that's what Gustave Le Bon, shared with us, that this primitive perception of crowds as, these mindless zombies that all gather together and lose their individual control, comes from, Gustave Le Bon's work. And I just find it interesting that if you look at the definition of, well, not definition, but the meaning of the word crowd, as in the translation into other languages, crowd, the word crowd in French is foule, F-O-U-L-E. Now, remove one letter, you get an English word, which is foul. So not very positive light. In Latin, this is even nicer, vulgus. Crowd means vulgus. It also means turba, turbulent, vulgar. So we don't really paint a very good perception of crowds. And so, that historic belief still resides, in our DNA, you could say. And as we sort of progress around to, the 20th century, and Elias Canetti was one of the sort of, spearheading this new evolution of actually, hold on a second, crowds aren't all that violent. Aren't always violent, often are not, and they don't panic, actually. They're not mindless. So Elias Canetti's book Crowds and Power is what started kind of shifting the rudder, so to say. And now we've got, we've got Professor Drury, we've got Dr. Templeton, we've got Dr. Riker, we've got a lot of psychologists, so looking at the crowd psychology. We've got Professor Still looking at the more dynamics and mathematics side, and actually was the one who came up with the definition for crowd science, which is the study of the effect of density, dynamics and behaviour on a crowd and crowd safety. So, the crowds, and that was only, evolving in the last, couple of decades. So this is very new still, very new. And from the studying that, I've done over the last number of years, the shift, there was these conversations and obviously Canetti's work was kind of being produced, but wasn't really being adopted in practice because especially with the police training in the UK was based on Le Bon's work, that crowds needed to be subverted, need to be controlled. We used to call it crowd control. People still call it crowd control. So, this is once again very, very new, and we've got 7 billion people to catch up on. And from my perspective in the UK, in this part of the world, the shift in perception really anchored at the time of the Hillsborough disaster in 1989. Now, before that, we had a number of disasters, at various stadia, but I'll pick out the Ibrox disaster in 1971, where 66 people died in a crowd collapse on Stairway 13. There were actually deaths and injuries at this location a number of times before this happened. So it didn't come out of nowhere. And the report that was commissioned to understand what went wrong, the Wheatley report, when that was produced, the Prime Minister at the time, Edward Heath, was quoted saying that we cannot have another disaster. Crowd safety ought to be covered by law. And this, was a part of a catalyst for bringing in the Safety of Sports Grounds Act 1975. And we still had issues. We still had the Hillsborough disaster. But after Hillsborough was when the regulation came in, enforced regulation, which was the Sports Ground Safety Authority. And since then, we've had no, touch wood, no disasters that look like the ones that we had before that. So that's a thread that I will go into another time, because my master's dissertation was on the impact of legislation and regulation on crowd safety, particularly at outdoor events, because sports grounds now have a great system in place. They've got the law, they have the regulatory body, and they have a guidance book, the Green Guide, the Guide to Safety at Sports Grounds. And there's legal stipulations. You can't just have anyone walk into a sports ground and organise an event. There's a whole team in place, a safety officer, a licence, certificate, everything. Yet that doesn't apply to outdoor events. So that is something I'd like to talk about another time. But that shift came in 1989, and once again, the media were fanning the flames of hooliganism. The crowd are at fault. The crowd caused this. The crowd are the issue. The police were trying to control the crowd because they thought the crowd were attacking them, when actually they were dying. They were asphyxiating, and they were reaching for help. So the supporters, the loved ones of those who died, and the Liverpool supporters boycotted The Sun, which was one of the major media outlets that were blaming the crowd, because they said this wasn't the crowd's fault. This was the organisers' fault. And that I see as that real catalyst for starting to really bring to light into the political system, into the society, into our culture, that hold on a second, actually it's not the crowd's fault. it's the systems that we've put in place that have resulted in this happening, and it's actually our responsibility to keep these people safe. So we started to go from crowd control, which is, we're restricting the movement and the behavior of crowds. I see crowd control as a very reactive approach. It is usually carried out by the police, because when we need to control a crowd, that is when we've lost control as an event organizer. And so that's a last minute resort, or the last resort is crowd control from my perspective. Crowd management is the systematic plans that we put in place to manage the flow, the dynamics, and the movement of people and their behaviour as well at an event. So the crowd management is that the planning that we put in place. And that is now what we were seeing. We're seeing our proactive planning for how we will look after these people when they come to an event, how we predict that they're going to behave, how we know we're going to move, what systems we're putting in place to help them move from one place to another, what systems we're putting in place to make sure that density doesn't build over an unsafe level. So that's what we're seeing now. And crowd safety is the actually, someone in my last video, someone said, how about crowd safety as a strategy? And crowd safety is the strategy, the sort of the way of looking at how we manage the crowd safely, because crowd management is also the human beings on the ground that are directing, guiding, stopping, letting people go, pointing people in different directions, and there for the emergency to get people out. So the management is also seen as the human beings on the ground carrying out the role, the human beings in the control room, giving the instructions and making sure that the plan is carried out as per the agreed strategy. So crowd science, as I defined earlier, is the study and encompassing both the psychology and the dynamics, the physics, the mathematics, both the physical crowd and the psychological crowd. Because you have both. You can have a psychological crowd and not a physical crowd. A psychological crowd could be all of the Taylor Swift fans all over the world. But until they come together at a Taylor Swift concert, then they become a physical crowd. You can have a physical crowd that, on a busy shopping street, but they don't all share social identity. So shared social identity is a key kind of element, psychological element that factors in here. But let's say they're all walking up and down the street. They're a physical crowd because there's lots of people, but they're not a psychological crowd. They're not kind of moving together with the same intention. But then let's say something happens on this street. I don't know, someone does a daredevil climb down the side of a building or something, and then all of a sudden everyone stops and watches, and we all start talking to each other because we have this kind of shared interest in this stunt that someone's doing or something like that. So that's the kind of synopsis, should it ever appear in the Leaving Cert, of how we're shifting from this perception that crowds are mindless and dangerous to the fact that they are human beings and we're creating an event. We need to keep them safe. We are responsible for keeping them safe. We can't just create an event, welcome thousands of people, and then just wash our hands of their safety. We have a responsibility. They have a responsibility too, which is something I'd like to get into another time. But we are responsible. We're the responsible parent when it. We're the responsible event organizer when we're inviting people to our events, and this perception shift, studying, as I mentioned, by psychologists such as Drury and Templeton and Riker. They're the ones really kind of spearheading this notion and understanding that crowds don't panic. Actually, when something happens, if a disaster happens, a crowd can turn from a physical crowd into a psychological crowd because they now share the disaster that has happened. Something. A train crash or a terrorist attack or something. And actually, instead of kind of running for their lives, the majority of people go back into, wherever the issues happened and start helping each other and supporting each other. And this is now called, when we need help, we call first responders. This is now being called zero responders. So the people who are already there on the scene, on the ground, are called the zero responders. So how we perceive the crowd to be is so important. It's so important because it triggers our response and how we respond and the strategies and the actions that we take. If we think the crowd are, attacking something or trying to break into somewhere, we're going to behave completely different than actually if that crowd are being pushed into a place and are actually trying to get out because they can't breathe. Our response can be completely different. So it's very important that we understand what really is going on. And it's very difficult to really, truly understand what's going on because our perceptions are so different. And so actually it's really important to understand how we see a crowd. For example, a person might love being in a mosh pit. It's not my thing. I don't feel safe in a mosh pit. And it's not something that I would be interested in. Even though I'm fascinated by crowds, I don't actually like being in a crowd. Whereas somebody else, it's what they live for. They can't wait to be in it, and there's a shared social identity with moshing, because there's like these unwritten rules of engagement and people really enjoy it, and that's great. So from one perspective, you could have someone who looks at a mosh pit and they go, oh my God, the crowd are in danger, and then try and go in and try and break it up, and actually then upset everyone and cause issue because that's not the culture that's expected of those who are actually around the mosh pit to keep them safe. So there are different ways that we can look at it. Once again, going back to Katie's PhD, I'm very interested to what she's going to bring forward. So, as we evolve from crowd control to crowd safety, we also need to be aware of our own perceptions, how we see the crowd. Do we see the crowd running off in a panic, or do we see the crowd actually being far more calm and turning back and helping other people? How would we respond to each of those scenarios? What would we do differently to each of those scenarios? So I think the most important thing is not seeing the crowd as mindless, because that is once again that old study on crowds. And what's coming out with the new research is that they very much maintain their own decision making. They didn't lose themselves in the crowd psychologically. They still maintain their own integrity of who they are, but they are now conforming to an emerging norm. So that emerging norm of whatever happens in the crowd. We then kind of decide to maybe put our usual standards away and adopt new standards. They could be higher or lower, whatever's happening. So it's very important to understand that, they are still people. Yes, when we see people move, they might move like cows, referencing the podcast episode, or they could move like sheep, but we still need to remember that they are still people. They still maintain that decision making. So, and that forms part of our crowd safety strategy of how we communicate with these people, how we arm them with as much information for them to be able to make their own decisions. So I've kind of gone down a few various trails here. So I hope it kind of helps just give a flavour of this particular shift from crowd control into crowd safety that is still evolving. There's strategies that we're applying today that we might look back in 10 years and go, oh, should we have done that? So, we're still learning. And I think the more that we can all stay open and all stay humble in learning, then I think that we've got the best mentality for keeping our crowd safe as much as possible. Thank you.